continuing on here in lesson 6.4 about completing the square. Now we'll look at an example where a is not equal to 1. It's a little bit different than the last example, and this is where you actually have to do step number 1 right here. So if you look at step number 1, we have a 3 right here. So we need to, let me write this over here to the right of where I listed my steps again. Okay, so your first step here is to divide everything by that coefficient to get it down to just x squared. Okay, so then it's minus 2/3 x minus 1/3 is equal to 0. So there's step number 1. Divide all the terms by the coefficient of x squared. Move the number term, so the term that doesn't have x on it, we need to move that to the other side. So I'm actually going to add 1/3. So I have x squared minus 2/3 x, leave a space, is equal to 1/3, because we're going to have to complete the square here. Alright, step 3, complete the square on the left side of the equation, take half the coefficient on x and square it. Now I want you to notice the coefficient on x right here is a fraction. So here's what you need to do if it's a fraction. Instead of writing divided by 2, we're going to multiply by a half. We're going to take half of it, so multiply by a half. So half of negative 2/3 is, the 2's cancel, so I get negative 1/3. I'm going to take that number, negative 1/3, and I'm going to square it. Take half the coefficient on x and square it. Well, negative 1/3 squared, square the top, 1, square the bottom, 9, it'll be positive. Negative 1/3 times negative 1/3 is 1/9. So I'm going to put plus 1/9, but I have to do it on the other side also. Okay, it just gets a little messier and we have to deal with fractions. Now we're going to take this side right here. This is where you have to know how to write this as a binomial squared. You don't want to try and factor when you have fractions. It gets really messy. So I just want to write this as x. That sign is going to be the sign in the binomial, because my middle term, my x term, is negative, so it's minus. And then the thing that goes here after the minus is always what you squared to get the 1/9 that we added to both sides. Well, that was the minus 1/3. So that's what's going to go there. Okay, on the right hand side, I need to add these two fractions. Let's find a common denominator, which is 9. You can also use a calculator, but that would be 3/9 multiplying by 3. So 3/9 plus 1/9 will be 4/9. Okay, take the square root of each side. Let me move this up a little bit. So I take the square root. That leaves me with x minus 1/3 equals positive and negative. Don't forget that. The square root of 4/9, which is the square root of 4 over the square root of 9. Both of those are perfect squares, so that's 2/3. So positive and negative 2/3. So there's step 4. Now we need to get x alone. We're going to add 1/3. Add 1/3. Put it in front of the plus minus symbol, so I have x equals 1/3 plus or minus 2/3. So how do I get my roots from that? Let's extend the page here. I'm going to take 1/3 plus 2/3. And my other one, I'm going to do 1/3 minus 2/3. We already have common denominators, so this will equal 3/3, or 1. This one will equal 1 minus 2 is negative 1/3. So we get 1 or negative 1/3. Please do not give decimals. I want fraction answers when you go through this. So 1 or negative 1/3. Okay, now we're going to look at an example where we have an odd b value. We just looked at where the b value was a fraction. You have to do something similar when you have an odd b value. So it's x squared minus 3x minus 5 is equal to 0. First step again, divide by the a value or what's in front of x squared, if it's something other than 1. In this case, we have a 1 in front of x squared, so we can skip over step 1. Step 2, move the number term to the right side of the equation. So we want to move this to the other side, so we're going to add 5 here. So x squared minus 3x, leave a space, is equal to 5. Now, step 3, complete the square on the left side of the equation. Take half the coefficient on x and square it. So here's what I want to do. I want to take half of this, so negative 3 divided by 2, which is negative 3 halves. And then we're going to leave it as a fraction. Do not write it as negative 1.5, leave it as a fraction. So we're going to take negative 3 halves, and we're going to square it, which equals 9/4. I square the top, square the bottom. So I want to add 9/4. I want to add 9/4. Okay, now we're going to write this side as the binomial squared. It's x. This is a minus sign, so it's minus. It basically is this number right there. So it's a minus 3 halves fraction. Okay, on the right-hand side, okay, you can either, if you know how to do fractions on your calculator, but you want to have it be a fraction at the end. I'm going to show it by finding a common denominator, which if we do 5/1 plus 9/4, my common denominator is 4. I'm going to multiply. So it's really 20/4 plus 9/4, which is 29/4. Can't be reduced, so we get 29/4 over here. Do not write it as a mixed number. Do not write it as a decimal. Leave it as an improper fraction. Okay, now we're going to do the square root of each side. Square root, so it's x minus 3 halves. Square and square root undo each other. Equals. Now, positive and negative, I do the square root of each. If you notice, on the bottom there's a perfect square. On the top we get square root 29. The square root of 4 is 2. So I have positive and negative. If you could simplify the square root on top, you would need to do that. 29 is a prime number. Can't be simplified. Okay, so it's square root of 29 over 2. Bottom number was a perfect square. Now I need to get my x alone. I add 3 halves. I add 3 halves. So here's what I have. X is equal to 3 halves plus or minus square root 29 over 2. All right, down to the roots and how you want to write this. Your final answer. So these are irrational because we have a square root left in our answer. I'm going to have 3 halves plus square root 29 over 2. And I'm going to have 3 halves minus square root 29 over 2. Now, because we're going to do quadratic formula in the next lesson, I'm going to look at combining this into one fraction. Okay, notice you already have a common denominator, so it's 3 plus the square root 29 over 2, and 3 minus the square root 29 over 2. You could write your answer as 3 plus or minus square root 29 over 2, which is a lot of times when we get the quadratic formula in the next lesson for solving quadratics, how we write the answers. That really means 3 plus square root 29 over 2 and 3 minus the square root 29 over 2. Many, many steps involved with completing the square, and depending on what the b value is, a fraction or an odd or whatever. Okay, last example we're going to look at is when we get complex solutions. Complex means non-real, meaning you're going to get a negative under the square root, which means you're going to have an I on your answer. Non-real solution. So, let me write this over here. Again, first step is to divide by a if there's anything other than a 1 in front of x squared. This has a 1, we don't have to do that. Step 2, move the number term to the other side. So I want to subtract 3, so x squared plus 2x, leave a space, equals negative 3. Okay? Step 3, complete the square on the left side of the equation. Take half the coefficient on x and square it. Here's the coefficient on x. That's even, so I can actually take half of it, divide it by 2. It's 1. We want to take 1 and square it, so I get 1. I want to add 1 to both sides, because now I can write this side as a binomial squared. it is x, whatever sign that is, plus whatever we squared to get that. So it's x plus 1 squared. Again, if you look at this trinomial, it would factor into x plus 1, which can be written as x plus 1 squared. Okay, on the right side, I'm going to combine these two. Not dealing with fractions this time, so that's negative 2. Now, take the square root of each side. This is why we're going to have a complex solution, because we had a negative under the square root. So it's x plus 1 is equal to, we still need the positive and negative, square root negative 2. Okay? So we're going to break this down into square root negative 1 times square root 2. The square root of negative 1 is I, so I really have positive or negative I square root 2. Square root of negative 2 is I times the square root of 2. Now sometimes you might have a number other than 2 here, or a root other than 2 that can be simplified. You would need to do that if that was the case. Now we need to get our x alone by subtracting 1, putting it in front of the plus minus symbol, so it's negative 1 plus or minus I square root 2. You could leave your answer that way. Writing it as two separate roots would be negative 1 plus I square root 2, or negative 1 minus, let me rewrite that, negative 1 minus I square root 2. That would be as two separate roots. So complex solutions, because we ended up with a negative underneath the square root.